James Wan and Leigh Whannell's sophomore film, titled Dead Silence, is, as Leigh quotes, a lesson in what not to do. It's a perfect example of when a production company thinks they know what's going to work, when they really just should have left it up to the writers. That's not to say this 2007 film is bad, but we'll get into it. My name is Ty Weimer, and I love movies. I love the cinematography, and I love the production of films, and I really enjoy focusing on director and seeing their style change throughout the years due to learning different things and life experiences and just different circumstances. In today's video, we're going to be continuing the series that I'm doing on James Wan's movies, and we are looking at his second film, Dead Silence. Dead Silence has gained a bit of a cult following the past few years, enough to warrant a 4K re-release, but the consensus was not so popular in 2007. Fans thought the acting was flat and that the story was convoluted, and I think honestly a lot of them didn't understand the jump from gore, like torture porn almost, to supernatural horror. I don't think a lot of people liked the transition very well. I think hindsight actually cleared that up for us a little bit, because James Wan actually goes on to make films such as Insidious and The Conjuring, Malignant, so he does show over the years that he's quite the supernatural horror fan, and that's truly where his love of horror lies. As we've mentioned, two big horror genres that James absolutely loves is supernatural horror and creepy doll horror, and he kind of mixes those two in this film. I think the mix goes together pretty well in this film. I think you can really tell this is a James film with all the creepy dolls, but I think having the Mary Shaw character felt almost like a precursor to one of the villains in Insidious. So it makes a lot of sense as to why they went with this route, you know. Our well-loved duo, James Wan and Leigh Whannell, are back just 3 years after the release of their Saw movie. That small jump in time ended up being somewhat detrimental to the duo, as they explained that the reason Dead Silence exists is kind of because their producers were really pushing them to make a second film to keep the public interest going. You know, they had such a big success with Saw. You know, it only makes sense to continue creating more things that is in that area, you know. Leigh felt like they were grasping for straws rather than creating a passion piece with their first one, and that is really where a lot of art can fall flat. There's a phenomenon that I tend to think of, that the first thing somebody creates is something that they've had rattling around in their head for years. They've kind of already had the idea in mind, you know, so it's a little bit easier to put that into reality when you've already got such a good idea of what you want to do, and then you make that, and then you're like, oh shit, now I have expectations, you know, now I have people that are interested in my stuff, which is great, but now I have to appeal to them, and I have to make money, and those two things it makes the sophomore effect very hard. You know, a lot of sophomore albums fall flat almost because the bands don't exactly know how to give the fans what they want and how to make the money that they need, but also creating something that they're proud of and passionate about. James is a little bit here and there with his opinions on the film. He's said a couple things that were a little bit indicative of him not caring a whole lot. Not caring, but like just it seemed like the production process was frustrating for James. But at the same time, he's quoted to say that he's glad the film that Leigh and him had a lot of passion for was starting to get a lot of love. So, you know, at the end of the day, it's something he created. It's his art. Of course, he wants his art to do well, and he wants people to love it, so that makes sense. There's honestly not a whole lot of information about this movie that I could find. I couldn't really find a complete production notes necessarily. I couldn't really find a whole lot of information about how the movie was created, which really made me sad, because I could tell that there was a lot of production that went into it, and I would really like to know about it, you know. Filming for this movie took place in Toronto, Canada, and honestly, here lately, Toronto is really seeming like the new LA for filming. And 2007 was a long time ago, technically. So, I mean, they weren't jumping on that trend necessarily to like they are now, but hey, I mean, James has always been ahead of the curve, right? So they took the filming out of Hollywood, but that's not to say that they didn't have Hollywood problems. Lee explains in a now archived blog post that he and James were approached at the Sundance Film Festival when they were premiering Saw by the producers to create a second film in case that Saw flopped. Both of them being very new to the industry and not exactly knowing how to advocate for themselves, they agreed to the project, and Lee explained he basically locked himself up in his apartment and forced him to just sit and write until he figured out anything that made sense. He said it was creativity at gunpoint, which is not what you want to be doing as a creative. You never want it to seem like your art is being forced out of you. And in a situation where you live in a capitalist society, that's just kind of how it has to be. If you want to do what you love for a living, sometimes your art is going to be forced out of you, but at the same time, it sucks, and it's very draining for a person, and it creates a lot of burnout. Universal Studios, which was the company that picked up this movie, decided to take the liberty of hiring a script doctor who Lee basically said heavily scrutinized every aspect of his screenplay. A version of the script exists where it is actually set in vaudeville and doesn't just flash back to it. But Universal argued that period pieces don't work very well and opted for the flashback aspect instead. I think, honestly, it might have done better in the box office originally had it been set in vaudeville. I think period pieces in horror is not something that you see very often, especially back then. Now it's a little bit more common, I think, but I don't think I've ever really heard of a horror movie set in actual vaudeville, and I think that would have been really interesting. That would have set this movie apart from its competition very well, and I think that would have been a good successor to Saw. Like, you know, you had a really high success with Saw. Let's do it again by setting yourself apart from everybody once again, just like you did with Saw. I think had they done that, I think they would have had a lot of better initial success with the movie, but I'm not Universal, so I didn't have a say in it. The experience of this film actually made Lee stop selling pitches for a long time. What he ended up doing after this was he would just finish scripts, he would write them on his own time, and then sell those out, because he felt like the experience with this just really truly made him realize he never wanted to do that ever again. He never wanted to sell pitches again, because when you sell a pitch, you're selling an idea. You know, you're not selling a full story. For the full script, that's the story. And sure, it can be doctored a little bit, you know, changed here and there, but with a pitch, it's just an idea. And it's hard for two people to see eye to eye on the same idea. You know, Lee would probably have a lot of intentions that, you know, the director or the producers didn't want to do, and that's why we have Dead Silence. James seemed to have had a little bit of better experience with production. He hasn't really said a whole lot about this film. He mostly just supports it on his Facebook and his Instagram. At one point on Instagram, he mentioned that it was a wild ride for him and Lee, so that is a little bit indicative of some shit going down, I think, but he always refers to it lovingly. He also mentioned that he grabbed one of the 101 of Mary Shaw's dolls, because they created 101 dolls for Mary Shaw for that film, and there was one that he absolutely fell in love with and did not want to destroy, because they really truly did light all of those fucking dolls on fire at the end of that movie. Spoiler alert, but if you're looking for a spoiler-free video, this is not fucking it. But yeah, so he still has that one creepy doll on his shelf to this day, and I think that's very, very authentically James, you know. But I think that's really cool that he fell in love with those dolls so much that he had to keep one. The movie was filmed with a celluloid 35mm film and has an aspect ratio of 2.39 to 1, which is one of the standard aspect ratios you'll see in a theater. Honestly, I think the film looks beautiful. like, camera work aside, I really, really love the art direction, and I really wish Universal would have let them go harder with the vaudeville aesthetic. Like I said, I think that would have done really well for them, and it would have been super fucking interesting to see. I just think the film was almost quirky, and it almost felt like a satire on small town life. You know, I always kind of joke that my small town, before the internet was big, was set 10 years in the past, and this is kind of... This film kind of feels like that to like a bigger extent. Jamie, the main character, he lives in the city with his wife, and then after she is murdered, goes back to his hometown, which is a very small town, and it's vaudeville inspired, you know. So I think that's really interesting that they took that, the visual difference of the parts of Jamie's life is very juxtaposed. The crazy city life versus the calm home life, or like the calm small town life, but neither of those are safe, you know. The set design was incredible, you know, the theater was beautiful. Even when it was like broke down and disheveled, it still looked great. You could tell that they put a lot of fucking effort into it, and it was a beautiful film. I very much enjoyed the set design, the estate that Jamie's father lives in. That was beautiful. The spiral staircase, you know, I thought that was great. You really hone in on like the rich kid that was emotionally neglected vibes from that estate. You know, they really hit the nail on the head there. The film is also beautifully atmospheric. As soon as Jamie gets to his small town, the color grading changes to this almost blue-grayish tint, and that adds an air of a creepy, uncomfortable feeling, but it also brings this almost like nostalgic feeling, which you'd think that those two ideas would clash, but they don't. They work very well together. It creates almost a confusing experience for both the main character and the audience. The blue tint and, like, you know, the supernatural aspect of it very, very much makes it feel like a precursor to Insidious. Like, this is what they had to make in order to come up with Insidious. And sometimes that just happens. Sometimes you kind of have to have a flop era in order to create something amazing. Like, that's how it be sometimes. It seemed like they really wanted to get away from their mold that they put themselves in with Saw, and I don't think they necessarily put themselves into a mold too heavily, because it was only their first film, so it's not like they had years of like torture porn under their belt that they were having to escape from. It was just one film, an amazing film at that. Don't get me wrong, it was a fucking amazing film. But they still wanted to distance themselves from it, and it makes sense. They didn't want to seem like they could only do one thing. You know, they wanted to seem well-rounded, and they wanted to, at this point in 2007, also, supernatural horror was just popular at this time. The torture porn craze kind of died down, and it was getting more into the creepy, what lurks behind the shadows kind of thing. You know, do you believe in ghosts kind of freakiness. And it's also very possible that they just preferred it. And that's what it seems like, because James does continue to make more supernatural horror movies in the later years. So it seems that in 2007, this seems like an odd jump, because their first one was Saw, but looking back, Saw is kind of his black sheep, you know? The scoring was done by Charlie Clouser, who works very, very close with James, which makes this film feel a lot more, you know, authentically James. You're gonna hear a lot of those same horror stingers that you're used to, and it makes it feel like a James film. There are a lot of things that there's a couple things that we'll see that James kind of creates and kind of takes as his thing. And one of those is working with Charlie Clouser. They really love working together, and I think it's great, because Charlie Clouser is an amazing composer and does great work. The music was amazing in this film. The cool thing about this movie is, you know, there's a lot of dead silence in it. Whenever Billy the Puppet is doing his thing, it goes silent. And the first time it happened, I didn't quite realize that was going to be the motif. I just thought it was to create a different kind of suspense that we had never really seen before, and I think it does both. Obviously, it's his motif, it's how he does things, but it's different, you know. You're used to, even in like jump scare horror, you're used to like a little bit of like atmospheric spooky sounds in the background, and then you get jump scared. It's very rare that you just the sound just cuts out completely, and you're forced to almost kind of fill in the blanks. It was also kind of, I think, the first film to really add silence into a movie that wasn't A Quiet Place, and A Quiet Place isn't horror, but you know, it was the first movie to really rely on the lack of sound, and I think that's really interesting. The director of photography was John R. Leonetti, and he and James worked very closely together to create the visuals and direct the camera and the lighting and the composition. And because of that, the movie is fundamentally filmed very well. The exposure of the film is very low, which adds to the overall tone of the movie, and conveys a very dark, creepy, and somber feel, you know, to the film. Low exposure is great for horror films because it darkens the surroundings, you know. It enhances the already dark shadows and creates a lot of suspense because you don't know who's lurking in that darkness, you know, you don't know what's back there. So using low exposure is very much an important tool as a horror director. The composition of this film was great as well. I felt like there was never too much or too little room for a character. I felt like they always stayed in their rule of thirds pretty well. And you know, all the different kinds of shots were there as well, which is great. James has his definitely awry. There's a lot of great establishing shots in this one. That's really what I think of when I think of this film. I think of the establishing shots. You know, the Jamie driving his car into the town, and Jamie looking up at his father's estate. The close-ups are very good. Created a lot of claustrophobia. You know, made a lot of suspense. The coloring was really great. There was a scene where they're in a motel where Billy starts doing his thing, and the red light from the no vacancy sign outside is casting a shadow on his face, or well, it's like casting a light on his face. So he has this like red lighting as well to his face. That really adds to the what the fucking fuck is going on, and I really like that. I thought that was good. The one shot I think of in particular that was probably my favorite was Jamie looking up at his estate, standing in front of his car. I thought it was great. The symmetry was really good. It was very reminiscent of Wes Anderson films. It was probably not a nod to his work at all because, you know, oh my god, symmetry, Wes Anderson. No, but I thought it was very good. He does it again with Donnie Wahlberg's character. After Detective Lipton is interrogating Jamie, and the camera tilts down to Jamie getting out of a taxi, and the symmetry is there as well. And it brings the taxi brings a bright contrast to the very dark background, which I think is really interesting. The whole group of scenes of him driving around his childhood town is very interesting, I feel, because, you know, Jamie is so young and has such a different perspective of the world than all these old heads that live in his hometown do. And so him driving his bright car, or riding in that bright taxi, is almost a visual description, like a visual representation of him being this bright and very clearly out of place person in this dark and almost depressing environment. James also starts experimenting with different transitions in this film, which is interesting to see, although I'm not sure if they're very good transitions. The one that I think of is where it zooms in on his eye, and then it zooms out, but then it zooms right back in, and it's just really confusing because you don't know exactly what that transition is conveying. And then there's another scene where, like, when Jamie is driving into his town, and it like zooms in onto the Ravens Fair sign and then zooms out, but then zooms back in again. I don't know. It's really weird. Those two transitions were kind of confusing, and I didn't really like those ones, but one of the transition I do like was when the camera transitioned into a map and then it was like transitioned into Jamie driving. That one was really good. I did like that one. That one made sense. It was similar to the Raven's Fair sign one, but it was just slightly different, and I think it was done well. The camera work in this film also felt a lot more deliberate than Saw. You can tell that it was very much storyboarded out, was based on his storyboard. I think it's a very different feel from Saw because Saw was very quick, exciting, and anxiety-inducing with its cuts, but Dead Silence is very slow and deliberate, and it wants you to really take in your surroundings rather than it wants you to see the set design. It wants you to take time and looking at the environment and really immersing yourself into this world, whereas Saw wanted you to be very claustrophobic, and it only wanted you to see what it wanted you to see. And there was a lot of messiness that it had to cover up. You know, there was a lot of loose ends that they had to tie up and not show, and there was a lot of they had to have the camera a certain way so that you wouldn't see this or you wouldn't see that, and because of how small the Saw sets were, it was very difficult to create large, slow-moving scenes, you know. But with Dead Silence, they were able to do the establishing shots, and they were able to do more wide shots, and just, you were really able to see a lot more in this film, and I really liked that. The camera work of this film just overall feels more professional. That's not to say it's better. Professional does not always mean better. I personally prefer Saw and the camera work of Saw and the editing of Saw more than I do of Dead Silence. That's neither here nor there, but you can very much tell this was very much produced. You know, you can tell that it's a Universal Studios film. You can tell that it had a production company. You can tell that there were people working on it and there was money put into this. James's budget was much, much higher for this film than it was for Saw, and you can very much tell that. It's very apparent. The only part of this film that I could say was lacking was honestly the story. That's not something we really focus with this series, but, and that's also not necessarily Lee's fault. That's not Lee's fault. He very much tried to get the film that he wanted out into the world, but Universal was not having any of it. They wanted to make what they were going to make, and that was going to happen. And that's honestly why I have a hard time appreciating this film as much as I do his other ones, like James's other ones, just because I love Lee's writing, and I really think Lee has a gift for writing scripts, specifically horror ones. He has just enough comedy in him that really adds an air of lightheartedness to his horror films while still keeping them nice and fucking scary. And I think we lost a lot of good Lee-isms with the script doctor, and I really, really would like to have seen the original Dead Silence script. The original Dead Silence was also entitled, like, Shh, so I thought that was interesting. I'm kind of glad they didn't go with that, though, just because how the fuck are you supposed to say, like, yeah, I watched Shh last night? It just doesn't really roll off the tongue very well. You could still see some of Lee's writing here and there. I think the little quips that Detective Lipton says back and forth to Jamie, you can really see a bit of Lee's writing coming out there. I really wish I could have seen more of Lee's writing, but it's also possible that he just wasn't super passionate about it, so he didn't put as much love into it as he could have, which makes sense. There's really not a whole lot much else to say about this film, which is really sad. I wish there was a lot more about the production of this film. I'm really glad that it found its cult following. It's not my type of film, honestly. It's probably not something I'm going to go back and watch. I enjoyed it as a James film. You know, I think it makes a lot of sense for the rest of his work, and if you really want to know where that core came from, it's definitely a good watch. It's entertaining. You know, I I was gripped the whole time. You know, I didn't find myself scrolling through my phone during the movie. It definitely keeps your attention. It's a good film. Honestly, I like it. I just it's not one of my favorite James films, but I know it's a lot of people's favorites, and that's saying a lot. You know, it like I said, it recently, I think in February, came out with a 4K remaster re-release, so that was really cool. And there was a lot of I didn't pick that up. It came into my store. I should have picked it up, but I didn't. It had interviews with James and Lee, I believe, and I wish I could have listened to those, because I'm sure you would have gotten a little bit more insight on the production. But yeah, I mean, it's a good film. If you enjoy puppet horror, supernatural horror, or just even James Wan's movies, I think you should definitely give it a watch. I would highly recommend it. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I would greatly appreciate it if you could like and subscribe, so you're notified when I put my next video out. The next video that I put out should be part of this series. Who knows? But the next video of this series will be about James's third film, Death Sentence. So get excited for that. But alright, it's been real, guys. I will talk to you in the next video. Goodbye.